Todd and I are back to continue our discussion. On this episode, we get into digital versus physical. Which is better? Does it matter? Is there a better? I don't know. Let's find out.
Welcome to Panelism, the podcast where we talk about the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf. I'm Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask. Hey.
Good afternoon. It was all I could do not to crack myself up on that.
I was trying, for those of you listening in, I tried to intro this episode a couple times and it failed miserably. So I was trying to not laugh while Todd gave the intro, and you did a very good job, sir. So
it's amazing how meager our scripts actually are.
It's not that much, man. You think I could rattle off at this point? I'm just I'm in a mood apparently where I just can't. I can't do it. I can't take the lead. I don't know.
It's all right. It's just one of those days, man. How is it in Colorado right now? What's your weather?
We're all bracing for a wintry week to come. It was really nice. This is the standard Colorado weather where it's really nice and it kind of convinces you that spring is here, and then you get used to that. You're like, I'm not going to wear a coat today, and then 24 hours later it's blizzarding and snowing and 16 degrees, and that's where we're headed. So, it is. C'est la vie, such is life.
Yeah, a weather update here. I've got the heater on.
If you were listening last week, you'll know Todd's heat was a point of interest, apparently. I don't know why.
Weather on the ones.
Weather on the ones with Todd and Taylor. Well, this week we're continuing our discussion of the form factor in which you read comics and graphic novels. We spent a good chunk of last week's episode on subscription versus ownership, and this week we're going to dive back into a tried and true topic of ours, which is digital versus physical. But before that, I want to give a quick little shout out. I feel if I didn't, I'd get called out on it and I'd feel guilty. Piece of news today. As of this very day, we're recording on the 17th of February. I just want to give a quick little shout out. Happy birthday. Happy 90th birthday to my hero and yours, Alejandro Jodorowsky. That dude is 90 today. And I bring this up because he has just completed production on his latest film at age 90. Like, this is a guy who, is prolific in film and comics and everything that he's done. He's still at it. In fact, some would argue he's at his peak right now at age 90. So I love that because it just means there is no end to creativity. There's no end to putting your point of view out in the world. If you're a maker, if you're someone who's been struggling with your projects as of late or in general, or maybe you got sort of uninspired. I mean, just think about that. This dude at 90 years old is just cranking along, and some of his best work, in my opinion, and it gives me great hope for my own endeavors. So, happy birthday, sir. Anyway.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Anyway, we're talking about physical versus digital, and we've done this a few times. I don't have handy the episodes where we've done this before.
It's too numerous to mention, really. I mean, it comes up all the time. Yeah, sure.
We do. Whenever we sort of get not desperate for content, it just pops up, and then we just sort of gleam onto it. So we're going to do a whole episode just about this topic, and if we cover ground that we've covered before, so be it. But I think to get us started, let's look at another piece of news. As of President's Day weekend, Comixology is running a lot of sales. I came on Messenger earlier today, and you and Drew were talking about this image sale that was going on, and I have not purchased anything yet. I don't know if you have, but it's Comixology, so it's digital only. And it just, in my head, as I was thinking about, what would I want to buy today? The question popped in. It's like, well, do I want these digitally, or are there books that I would want to, actually have as a trade or a hardcover, or even just single issues? And it sort of brings this question back up again. So let's start with that. Have you purchased anything on the sale? How did you approach this thing?
I have not, actually, because I am still enjoying, I would say, my unlimited trial right now on Comixology. So when I started that and traveled 2 weekends ago, I downloaded like 15 books out of unlimited, like you click borrow and then you can download them to read them offline. And I've just still got this huge stack. And so I haven't even got, waded through the Image stuff really. I sent you guys the link. The only one that I think that jumps out to me is I think I will grab Infidel digitally because I've never seen it in person. I mean, I'm sure it's at my shop, but I haven't seen it.
It sells out kind of fast, though. I've noticed every time I've been in a shop, like I ask, or if I see it, they're like, "Oh yeah, we can't keep that on the shelves." That's a great thing. It's a hell of a story. We reviewed that in an earlier episode back in October during Halloween. So go back and check out our discussion on Infidel. But it's it's that same old thing of, do you have this? I mean, like in a perfect world, I'd have infinite shelf space in my home, and I could have some gigantic room that was just my Neil Gaiman size library, and I would just have everything be physical, and then I'd have maybe a copy digitally so that if I travel or if I'm just I don't want to go down to the library, I just have it handy. But that's you're always confronted with this idea of just the limitation of the physical side of things, even for bigger houses. Those folks who have a bigger house, it's just at some point you're going to run out of space. So it behooves of us to purchase things digitally. It's not quite the same experience depending on the book, which maybe that's another good point to bring in. Just the idea that a lot of digital titles have is it cover flow? What's the correct term to describe how Comixology?
Guided view.
Guided view. Thank you. If you're a Comixology user, you're no stranger to guided view. It really does make reading comics more cinematic. For those comics where that's appropriate. And I've mentioned a few in the past. Once again, Postal is a good one. Some of the, I think, was it the Dark Knight? No, not Dark Knight. There was another one that we were talking about before too, where just the way it's set up in terms of the panels and the way that guided view interprets those panels really makes it almost a totally different experience, but sometimes a better experience digitally than physically. You don't know which panels are coming up next. If you're in guided flow, you get to be surprised by the turning of the panel or the page. Don't necessarily get that in the physical mode. You get to see panels bigger sometimes. Information is communicated at a bigger view if you're using guided view on an iPad or a tablet or any kind of screen. So it really does come down to, everybody's going to have their own take on this. Nobody's going to be right or wrong, which is the nice thing. I don't think there's any definitive answer to this question, but it is worth considering. We come back to it so often. It seems to, and I don't know why we do. Maybe that's another interesting question too. Why do we keep coming back to this so often?
Well, I honestly, I think we've seen such an improvement in guided view and the offerings with it over just the past 3 years that we've been doing this podcast. Like it, we used to have discussions of like, I didn't really enjoy this on digital,
Mm-hmm.
and more it's like, oh, this is really working for me. And that's not, I don't know that, I think it's like parallel. We're getting, these two things are happening in parallel. One is we're getting used to it, but two is like guided view just got a lot better.
Yeah.
There used to be times where you would tap on it and it wouldn't actually go to the next panel.
Oh, that's right.
Just little things like that. Or it would do that thing where it would pop out of guided view all of a sudden. That seems to be a thing I recall where, and certain panels, whether they were left or, horizontal or vertical, like landscape or portrait, would mess with it. And now it's just, it's pretty seamless. Even for the, like, I've been reading a bunch of Image comics and I got a bunch of Boom Studios comics on Comixology. I downloaded like every Lumberjanes they had available. But even those, I know at one point it was sort of like, only Marvel was doing it right, or only DC or something like that. That's how I seem to recall it. When I would get something from Image, it wouldn't look as cool. And now it's working for everything. So
it is a little unfortunate that only Comixology seems to have this on lock. I haven't used the DC Universe app as much with comics reading, or the Marvel app. I would assume they're close, if not similar, but that's 3 platforms for this. It's worth noting, I think we made mention of it recently, but Image has stopped selling digital copies from their website. That used to be one of our go-to places, and they sunsetted that, I think this month, a couple weeks ago. we got an email back in November, December saying, hey, guess what? We're going to take that. We're going to stop selling digital comics. If you have your library, make sure you grab everything before we shut it down. And they sunsetted it, which I can see on one hand why they would do that. I feel like there was a missed opportunity for Image to really double down on people like us who are huge fans, who do a lot of Image collecting and really like that. So, I mean, did that sadden you? Was that just sort of par for the course as far as commerce goes? I mean, a thing we touch on only occasionally is that both you and I, make our living in digital content and marketing and media and stuff like that. So I just think of a lot of those things as like first of all, I hate talking about it as quote content. Yeah,
but
I struggle with that word too.
But there's such a I don't know, in everything to me, user experience matters. And Image maybe didn't have the resources to make an outstanding user experience for their digital issues.
Good point.
But so much, and it's it's like once Comixology had Amazon behind them, obviously they were going to start making great strides. But that's the difficulty. It's like you've got to offer a better experience than the other person. You can't just offer like a PDF download of it, not that they were, but
Image, to their credit, Image, when they were selling, did sell you, like they sold you the bundle of all the different files, or file extensions that you could use depending on your reader or your choice.
Yeah.
So you'd get like 4 or 5 files in a zip folder.
Yeah. So it's hard to say, like, was it did it not win sort of in the, ecosystem of stuff because it didn't have that perfect user experience of purchasing, or was it the user experience of the read? I don't know. It's hard to say. So I just, if they hadn't moved to Comixology and just ceased doing digital, it would have been a huge blow.
Oh God. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. I bought quite a bit of stuff digitally through Image. A lot of it was from their amazing sales they used to have. You could go and they'd have these crazy sales where you could spend $10 and get a ton of stuff, or get trade paperback volumes at very very heavily discounted stuff. I accumulated a lot of things. Managing that library was a little difficult, and I have actually found myself going to Comixology and rebuying specific things I had purchased through Image before, just so it's easier to sync between devices, between my phone or my iPad, and have sort of that centralized library where I can pull stuff down from. That really is, that's a killer feature, both on the Kindle side for just regular books. It's great having that one centralized library. Although there's that program called, is it LibriVox? I'll remember what it is. There's a book management. It's like iTunes for books, and it's free, and it lets you do a lot of conversion management. What is it called? Calibri. There we go. Calibre. You can use that for comics too, but it's one more thing. It's pushing you back to those days when you'd have to meticulously manage your iTunes collection and tag everything correctly and change all the meta information. It just gets a little tedious. And at the end of the day, to have a centralized repository where I can pull all my Kindle books down or all my Comixology purchases does make a huge difference. And and that could very well be a huge rationale in Image's decision. They just go, hey, look, we realize way more people are buying here than here. We don't want to manage that user experience or be penalized for a lack of user experience. That's just as valid. So that's kind of where I find myself, where I grab everything through Comixology. I don't necessarily love that they're holding all the keys to the kingdom as far as digital goes. I don't know what else would replace it at this juncture. It's an interesting conversation to have. But let me ask you this. With physical stuff, what drives your purchase to actually buy a physical copy of something?
Opportunity.
Okay.
If I'm in the comic book store, I will buy it physically, I think, given the price, but it's hard to say what that cutoff is. It's just sometimes you're looking at something, you go, it's not worth $19.99, but if I'm in a comic book store, I love buying physical stuff. Because I don't know that my consumption digitally has ever exceeded my analog consumption, except that this unlimited trial subscription has given me like this huge binging opportunity or problem, however you want to look at it.
Have you ever felt the digital experience? And you could take this question back to our subscription versus ownership discussion too. Do you feel that digital / subscription experience cheapens cheapens the book you're reading, and cheapens might not even be the right word, diminishes its importance? Because it can still feel like, oh yeah, but I got an experience, I enjoyed this, but because you're reading it very quickly through a subscription, or digitally, there's the heft of it isn't apparent to you. Maybe you don't read it again. Maybe you just sort of treat it like one of those movies you saw once, and you're good. You don't need to treasure it or come back to it or revisit it. Have you felt that creep into your reading?
Well, honestly, like the way you put it in our last episode about the book being kind of this little art gallery that you put on your table, that is such a beautiful way to put it, and it gives me a new way to look at those books. I don't know that digital cheapens it, because I could point to just so many physical things where something in the print quality or whatever just doesn't work for me. There were a lot of big 2 books in the middle 2000s or whatever, like 10 years ago or something, that they were starting to experiment with Photoshop effects and stuff like that. And you started to see the motion blur and stuff like that, and the printing just got kind of cheaper, and I hated that so much. And having printed versions of that is, it just looks even worse. So what I have really liked about digital is, I think as the user experience has improved, so has the art has worked better with it. Like you've pointed out several times in books you've read digitally, how just having the backlit screen actually improves the colors sometimes.
Yeah. Totally.
Where when it's printed, sometimes you just don't get that visual. So
and that highly comes down to the art. I mean, at the end of the day, the art drives a lot of these decisions.
Yeah. Well, I got a question for you on that. Yeah. Are we talking about 2 different mediums now?
Ooh, great question. We might be. We might be, because especially today, kind of following along your logic, when people first got a hold of Photoshop and digital tools to make stuff, very few of them really used it correctly. I mean, Hickman did. Hickman's very first thing, the Nightly News, is half infographic, half graphic novel, and it's in the way he used. I forget the exact creative term, but the way he used real photos and then built characters around actual pose stuff. Yeah. I forget, there's a term that describes that. And it's sometimes derided. A lot of artists hate that, but the people who do it really well, like Hickman did, I feel like just let him go. But Nightly News is kind of like one of the first digital first creations that I really liked. However, I love having it physically. I think it would have worked if I were to buy Nightly News on Comixology. I'm sure I'd love it, but I love having the hardcover anniversary edition, and just it something about it works really, really well there too. But it is interesting to wonder which books, if you make a book for print, Watchmen comes to mind. You need the grid, the subversion of the grid to truly understand Watchmen and all its nuances. If you're just seeing it panel by panel, you get the story, but you lose out on a lot of context that Alan Moore purposely built into it.
Yeah.
There are other comics, so think of some web comics, even stuff like the Oatmeal from way back in the day. That stuff doesn't work as well in books. Like I actually have a book of Oatmeal comics, and it's fun, but it's much more of a collector's piece, and it's less like, I consume it this way. It's more like the souvenir of being an Oatmeal fan.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Well, and I asked, we had last week on our previous episode about subscriptions versus ownership, I did sort of ponder the question of when you're not confined by this format of a book, which has to be X amount of pages. If it's a single issue, 12 to 15 pages, 20 pages, whatever it is. If it's a trade paperback, that's very much, that form factor is dictated by print, by former things that don't really matter as much anymore. Printing runs, availability, comics, like the comic shop shelf space, your shelf space, all these things that when you go to digital do not matter anymore. You got to wonder what books could be created in a purely digital format that have none of the existing conventions, the limitations. It could just be a book that goes on forever. There's no such thing as page numbers or issues. It's just a story that goes. That obviously would be, if we had more of that kind of thing, I think we'd be firmly talking about two different mediums. You could call them both comics, but they would be very different mechanisms of storytelling.
This is so interesting to me because I'm starting to grasp this weird area that I just didn't really have the vocabulary to talk about when I thought comics sucked when they were using digital tools. And it's that feeling of like, it was that inflection point of the digital tools weren't yet good enough to look like the analog tools.
Yeah.
So everyone derided digital because analog definitely looked better. And the same thing happened in music.
Movies, for God's sake. That exact statement I think Tarantino made numerous times in the early 2000s.
And I'm thinking of it in a really weird context, which is like about hybrids and electric vehicles too, where it's like when people bitch about a new technology and they sort of dismiss it, like there's a whole demographic of people that think that just want to crap on electric cars, and it's like, yeah, but you're just seeing what they are now. You're not imagining what they will be in 5 or 10 years, which is
even
when
they are now is awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. Let's talk about. It's more like what they were 10 years ago. It's sort of still what everyone is thinking of, And I think with digital comics, it's we're just getting over that hump now. That's what we're describing, is the tools are finally getting good enough that you can make really good art digitally that competes with print art. A lot of the artists I follow on Instagram, all of them, it seems, are using Procreate on the iPad. With the iPencil or whatever it's called, and
Apple Pencil version 2.
Yes, and they're but it looks more and more like, I think it's what's happening is it's a replicated and improved upon a normal workflow for an artist. I see them all do sort of a blue line sketch. I don't know if that has a specific term or anything, and then go over, kind of ink it themselves, pencil it themselves, and then ink it. And Procreate lets you do these little videos of your process drawing.
Oh, that's cool.
So yeah, they'll post those whole videos, and it's like, wow, I'm watching, they're working like an old artist. It's not that feeling of like, okay, they scan it in and then they open up Photoshop and they manipulate it in Photoshop. And, it's like we're finally getting the tools that make the art as good or better than its analog predecessor. Boy, that's a weird thing to put together.
And think about how many kids growing up now, when I say kids, I mean 10 to 15-year-olds, who are growing up, especially with Marvel being big, they're being exposed to comics properties, so they're more predisposed to being comics readers at any level. Now, the big difference between now and maybe in the 80s or 90s is that now they have all this, they have the entire legacy of work, plus all this killer indie work that's coming out weekly that we talk and praise, that literally the reason panelism exists is to celebrate all that. They're coming up now, they're looking at it almost like, kids, what's a good analogy for this? How do I want to construct this? Kids who were indie rock, kids in the late 80s, early 90s who went on to then, form these 90s bands like Nirvana or any of that kind of, any of those kinds of things. They sort of existed in a music business where the Beatles came out. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And then everybody sort of copied that. And then there was this boom of amazing creativity, and then this sort of lull, and then the 80s happened, and then just sort of like this, the kids who grew up with that being constant, made music in a very different way in the 90s and even continue to do so. I wonder, since graphic novels and comics have finally hit this sort of this inflection point in terms of the process and the distribution, like everything else has, they're almost kind of last to the table in this respect. What is that going to make? What are the comics of 2035 going to look like based on that?
Yeah,
it's going to be it's sort of exciting to ponder, because you're going to have creators right now breaking all these conventions. They don't all have to be kids. I mean, you could be, I'm sure some 70-year-old will do so. I focus on kids because they have no preconception about what came before. They're just only consuming things through their parents' iPad or their phone, thinking about things that way. It's going to be very interesting to see.
Yeah, and what started me free associating on that whole inflection point thing too was your example of Watchmen, which is it only breaks with convention when you know the print comic convention.
Yep.
Like Watchmen was never created. It was created in a universe where there was no digital option.
Yep.
It's it doesn't.
Ooh, there's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't. It only it could only deconstruct the print analog version of itself.
I have several books like that. I hate to keep always referencing Watchmen, but it's the easiest one to reference. But I have several books like that where I could not even begin to think about what that just even pondering the digital conversion or the experience would just seem very strange.
I got a great one for you, which is Dark Knight Returns, which I think does like in a panel way. Watchmen sort of breaks the panel system apart, and Dark Knight has this thing where they, Frank Miller like leaned into it in this crazy way where there are pages where it's just, oh my God. I mean, what is it like 24 tiny little panels, where it's just almost like when he does the talking heads thing,
where it's
just tiny little news anchors, like for one line each. So you're at the time that was super, it was like very much a grid pattern and a panel system, but the way he was using it was breaking it apart and also a commentary on sort of like video as a medium and things like that. Can you imagine that in guided view? It would suck. Oh, nobody wants to see those tiny panels.
I tried it. It's awful. It's not that you lose all the context, all the subtext that you just described. Yeah. It's not great.
It was impressive there to see the whole page with all the tiny little panels, That was the impression of the one single page, not panel at a time.
On the other end of the spectrum is something like No Mercy, which is a book I've talked about before, currently on hiatus. The very first issue of that book really struck me because it was the first time I'd see comics really embracing digital technology, the way they represent text messages, emojis, social posts. The kids in the story are constantly, at least at that point, updating and posting and taking pictures and stuff. And so to see the book sort of wrestle with that. And then as the story has gone on, that's all kind of fallen away for various reasons. I wish there was another book that kind of could do that. I'm sure there probably are a ton and we're just not aware of them.
Yeah.
Which is not surprise me, but there just this idea of what's today's version of that of Dark Knight Watchmen, where it's using what is available to us. What's the, communication norms of the moment and using those to tell the story or commenting on them in a subliminal way or a subversive way.
Well, and it's interesting. I don't have a good example of that either, but your comment sparked this in my head, which is it's interesting to me that when digital comics, sucked, like when it was like, when we could really point to that era, whatever it was, 2007, 8, something. One of the problems they were doing was Marvel and DC were trying these things like, I can't remember what they called them, but they weren't animated exactly. They were motion comics.
Oh, yeah.
Remember? Yeah. And it was sort of like they thought that's what would take over. Like, it's Spider-Man comics. And he looks like, it's like a flat version of Spider-Man, but like the background is moving behind him or something. And you're like, this looks terrible. And what actually worked for comics was to make the digital version more like a print version, just with guided view. Yeah. It's like they had to go back to what was making print work. They didn't, the gimmicks and stuff of animation weren't where comics needed to go. And that was definitely a fear I had. I remember talking to a comic book shop manager where I go and just talking to him about digital like 10 years ago and just thinking like, yeah, it's not going to, I don't want that. I don't want to see like animated Superman. That's just a cartoon. I'll just watch that,
The comic I'm glad you brought up comic shops because that's the other crucial component to all this. You walk into a comic shop, you're only going to get physical stuff. Like you can't purchase. I mean, some comic shops have some weird sort of their own digital store or some weird tie-in, but for the most part, you're only going to get physical there. You got to go to Comixology or DC or Marvel or some variation thereof
and
to get your digital
stuff. Really sucks. Yeah,
it does. And it's, there are ways to solve that. Although I think about the comic shops that you really like, or especially the ones I've talked about that I've raved about. Most of them operate almost as kind of a hybrid bookstore art gallery. They lean into the books that work really well physically, whether it be because of their presentation, their packaging, the nature of the book being such that it's more literary. It works better as a book. The comic shops I try to stay away from are just the ones where it's just the bog standard single issues.
Where it feels like the Walmart of comic.
Yeah.
Something. And I think here's everything that came out this week, and here's everything that came out last week, and
those are the shops that are not going to last much longer. If they haven't already gone out of business, those are the shops. They're not off, just like music stores. I mean, think about the music stores towards, kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s, before the fall really started happening for music.
Yeah.
Where you'd have the occasional music store you'd walk into and they would still sell vinyl, and it felt like, oh, somebody cares. Like somebody gives a shit about this. And then you'd walk into some bog standard music store. It was just the same inventory, the same layout. Nothing about it really did anything for me. And it's no wonder a lot of those stores just stopped, because they were purely commodity. There was nothing about them outside of that. And if you can get commodity through an easier mechanism, whether it be Amazon or some digital outlet or whatever it is, people are going to do that. So you have to offer something in addition to that commodity that decommoditizes, that makes it feel special and important and meaningful. And again, like an art gallery, like that's art. Comics straddles that really interesting that cross line of it's it's like books because there's authors, but it's like this is a lot of it is literally are works of art. So it's like an art gallery, but it's also kind of like a music store, but it's also like it's all these wonderful things packaged in one medium. And it's really, I'm surprised that it has survived a lot of these retail apocalypses as it has. And B, I'm all the more excited that as time has gone on, a lot of these shops get better and better. The books get better and better. Yeah. It's like the industry is kind of really figuring itself out now, beyond the limitations of DC and Marvel. Like everybody else is really coming up with these really awesome solutions. Anyway,
we talked about last week in our last podcast about digital and subscriptions and subscription versus ownership, and we were pointing out that it removes this critical social component of owning comics and being able to pass it off to your friend and stuff. And I think that's where comic shops can make a difference, is to step in and become the social hub for that stuff. You and I participate in a book club hosted by my comic book shop, and you are just about to do that.
Yeah, this week, going to my first.
And it's like, but when that happens, I can read the book digitally.
Yeah.
And the comic book shop is still bringing me together. I mean, it would be great if it were linked. Now, what my comic book shop does is they offer a discount on each month's book club book. So it incentivizes you to just go ahead and buy it from them, the physical version. But it's not like I'm not allowed to come if I read it digitally, that thing happened with Descender. As a matter of fact, we talked about it on our Descender podcast. So the comic book shop in that way is sort of, the trade and the social, trade there is happening in a different way than it used to. It's not the kids of Stand By Me passing around the same comic book or whatever my example was last week, but that's where they're stepping in. Now I think the last, big component we could talk about in this that affects both comic book shops and the creators is that business model. And I think one of the reasons comic book shops have actually survived like these digital apocalypses that have taken out other retail is because there is such a lock on physical comic book distribution.
Good point.
It's impossible to as far as I understand, you can't break the sort of monopoly that Diamond and not that anyone's even trying to do it. It sounds like maybe it's equitable for everyone. I don't know.
Do you know what's
opposing opinion? Please let us know.
That brings in, my sort of amalgamation of all the things comics and comic shops are. That distribution thing brings another one to the table, which is liquor. Like liquor stores typically operate there's like 2 or 3 liquor distributors, and if you try to crack that cartel, woe on to that person who tries to get in the way of that or circumvent that. And it kind of gives liquor stores, especially like the really good ones, like sort of that upper hand. And like you can't, Joe Schmo just can't go next door and start another liquor store. You have to kind of play by these rules.
Right.
Diamond is, we haven't, for all the episodes we've done, we haven't really talked about Diamond a lot. That is maybe we save that for another day, because that's a whole other thing that really does influence this.
We should definitely talk about it another time, primarily for the fact that I just don't know a lot about it. But
Same.
It's clear to me that is kind of the only game in town.
Yeah.
And on one hand, there's a real shortcoming of it, which is that they have, again, I don't know how most comic book shops feel about them. I don't know if there's a tension there or not, but I know that I, as a customer, have asked comic book shops about a specific book, and it's one that I could buy on Amazon, but I'm saying like, hey, if I could buy it from you, that would be even better. And because it is not in the Diamond distribution catalog, they can't carry it, carry it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have any other source of comic, as far as I understand. Maybe they've got like local and then Diamond. I don't know. But, to that extent, it does seem to be harming them, because there is other great sequential or graphic art that could be in comic book shops, but I don't know that they're even allowed because of their thing. But the other part of that I wanted to touch on is how it affects creators, and hopefully we can get this creator on an episode to talk about it. So I won't name them until we have that permission. But I had this interesting conversation with a person who both creates books but also helps publish them and distribute them and stuff. Mm-hmm. And that person hit me to this thing that there's this weird problem for indie creators in that you feel like you need to create the floppy single issues, mm-hmm. but there is there's just no profit in that at all. Mm-hmm. Like the cost to print, a run of single issues and what you might generate per sale is insane. I mean, it's just nothing. It's nothing. So it's
which really does confuse me, because Image falls into this trap all the time, where they'll start these amazing series and they'll do them. It's like you can't get to a trade until you've done 4 to 6 individual issues. Even then, like, they have these titles that if they just put them out as trades would do better than trying to build an audience via the single issues. Or maybe they've done a trade. Again, I come back to Nowhere Men and They're Not Like Us, which is created by the damn publisher himself. The actual publisher
editor,
of Image.
Right?
Editor. You're right. Editor-in-chief of Image. He did these 2 titles. You'd think that he'd go, I have a small but dedicated group. Instead of wasting time and costs on more single issues, I'm just going to put out volume 2 of each of these series as a straight 2 trade. There some shame involved with that? Like from a standpoint?
I again don't understand. I'm happy to be corrected on this. I think part of that is that stranglehold of the distribution, because in order to get that trade placed in comic book stores, you need to have those orders on the single issues. And it's like, you've got to participate wholly in the system.
But then how does Drawn and Quarterly get away with it?
Well, I don't think they do single issues at all, except for
that's what I'm saying. Like,
they're more of a specialty, they're more of a book publisher than they are a comic book publisher. But they're distributed in stores, so I don't know. Yeah, they've got something special. But this creator and I were talking about how the single issue format actually works in a great way as like Kickstarters for indie creators, which is if they could almost like sell. The way this came up was we were specifically talking about how it's useless to buy single issues on Comixology because it costs just as much as a physical copy of that. Yeah. So it's sort of like we always kind of feel like the digital one shouldn't cost as much. It doesn't make any sense that your overhead to produce a digital and an analog thing are the same. Like, it's,
I'll say that when they do that, it actually cheapens the physical version in my mind.
It's weird.
It just does, because it says, look, this thing that means more physically costs the same as digitally, even though it's a totally different experience. I mean,
and I don't know. How many new books would you check out if those floppy issues were just $1 on Comixology?
Quite a bit.
So many, but it would also tank the model. Like, it would destroy that whole model of like needing those orders in the comic book shops in order to know where, like, how many to print of the. Anyway, this indie creator and I were talking about how for indie comics that can work to their favor. They can sell those single issues digitally for very cheap, people interested in a book, and then go through the expense to print the a print version when their audience is established. They can get, it's the Kickstarter thing of like, hey, we can't actually print this until we have 1,000 people that want one. Mm-hmm. Well, but we can still distribute it to you digitally, so there's a lot to this economics problem that I don't know. It's interesting. It's difficult to take when you see that it's actually impacting like creators on that.
Yeah. So one of the best things Comixology could do is have a separate category that's like just upload, like literally you can create a Comixology creators account and just upload your shit, and they'll put you in a separate, there's like the publisher categories. They'll create another category called self create, whatever it is, Comixology creators category. I don't care. And then I, as a fan and a reader, can go and find any number of cool new things there. I think just like where's the next Ailish Cott gonna come from? The guy who did Zero, I can never pronounce his name correctly, but I think it's that he created Zero. He created a bunch of amazing material, a bunch of amazing books. He's kind of just a really great creator, being able to find that next guy, or even taking it one step further, saying, hey, Comixology, become a hub for all this stuff. Do what I just described. But also, if I'm a writer looking for an artist, I should be able to find that person there. Maybe not. I mean, DeviantArt is kind of that, and there's these other groups and stuff. But Comixology could own that entire value chain and really, bring more people into the medium. There's things they could do.
This is a huge shortcoming on our part, is that we keep saying Comixology, and I am kicking myself right now for not coming up with the name. There's a platform that does this exactly, and it's almost like Comixology is basically the iTunes of this business, and this other app whose name escapes me is the Bandcamp, where the indie artists can upload their own stuff, and it's it's perfectly compatible and it works everywhere, and you download it, you're just helping out the creator directly. And what the hell is the name of this?
Is it called Indie Planet or Comic Central?
Neither of those sounds familiar, but it wasn't what I was thinking of. Oh my gosh.
How about this? While you look, I'm going to read a couple comments. We had some great comments on Instagram after our episode last week on subscription versus ownership. I'm just going to read a few from, and I don't know how to pronounce this, but Messaman Child. He says, or he or she say, I personally like to own. Seeing the whole collection on my shelves is always so cool. Awesome episode. Thank you for that. Joe Smith, real name, says, great discussion. I'm still completely buying physical copies and graphic novels. There are stories such as The Kindly Ones, which I buy as gifts for people I know need that push. Something I feel would be cheap and buy an email exclaiming, at least physical book can be read at their own pace and sit on a shelf. And then somebody else writes, I asked them to expand on that. They said, my living situation is paper-based. There is no fire allowed. I'm a man among books and sketchbooks. Soon they will overtake me. I begged Kirkman and Otley to stop so I could live here a few more years. So this is a guy who's kind of like those crazy vinyl collectors, just keeps adding books. I would love to be one of those people. My wife will not allow it, and I shouldn't allow it because there's just not enough room. And at some point, I kind of, the Marie Kondo in me sort of flares up, and I want to tear down. And I would hate to have all these books that I'd have to look at and make some difficult choices about. Somebody else, Father Hodge Geekery says, I can't kick the habit of single issues, but have limited to 2 to 3 titles a week. I will read digitally on Unlimited or read my friends' copies of others. I do, however, with the money I save, buy nice hardcovers for stories I love for the bookshelf. So it seems like, just based on these comments and other people we've heard from over the last couple of weeks, that a lot of people are in the same boat, which is I do a lot of my primary discovery and reading digitally, but when it comes to the stuff I love and want to really honor, physical all the way. Very rarely does the digital, even though you own it technically, you can take the file and do with it what you will, doesn't mean the same thing as a physical copy.
Yeah, I totally agree with the interesting flip that when I discover, I am 100% more likely to purchase a single issue in print that's a title I haven't heard of or a title that I want to learn more about than I am on Comixology. Like,
that's interesting.
The weird Marie Kondo in me doesn't. I don't want the digital clutter of all these single issues that I end up not liking.
But wait, don't you have the same problem physically though? You have all these single issues.
No, I just give it away.
Oh, okay.
It just goes to a Boys and Girls Club.
Oh.
That is that I love walking through the comic book shop, and I don't love it when there's a week where I don't have something to get there, but I do love it sometimes when I'm like, I have the time or space or budget or whatever to go through all these series that I don't know and see what grabs me, like single issue wise, and I'll grab one. There's some weeks where, and actually I haven't been to a comic book shop in a while because of this unlimited subscription.
No.
So I've got a growing pull list that's ridiculous. Please keep holding on to that for me. But yeah, sometimes, there's nothing on the pull list and I'm like, oh, let me see, and unfortunately that usually ends up being like mainstream kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't really check out Image, single issues, that's the thing is like, I don't know. And I don't know. That's another place where the model just kind of fails because to me, I don't want to be picking up single issues. And I know our friend Drew is the opposite way. Like there are Image series that he loves and he picks up every single issue.
I have this issue though too, where, and I've mentioned it before, I will start a series, especially Image or Dark Horse or Boom. I'll start a series on the single issues, get hooked on it, and then go, okay, I'm going to trade these single issues for the hardcover. So I'll sell those or give those away and then get the trade of the single issues. Cause I like a lot of times when they combine it together, it flows better. You get some DVD extras in the back. But then, and a great example of this is I Hate Fairyland, which I started as single issues, then bought the trades, then traded the trades for that cool, like volume, like omnibus hardcover thing they're putting out. Like, so I kind of escalate up my love of something. I remember when East of West had first come out, and I was still kind of a little green in terms of how comic shops worked. I was just getting back into it pretty heavily. And I remember walking in going, hey, is there an East of West omnibus? And they're like, dude, that series is like, is 3 trades in. No. And I didn't quite understand why that was. Like why they wouldn't just go for that. I didn't realize how new it was. I thought it had been around for a while. But all that time later, now they have East of West, year 1, year 2, which are these giant hardcover, basically omnibuses. And I can finally grab them. I would, I'll have East to West digitally for the things I really like. So when I'm on the plane, because at some point when you have that big old book, it's very hard to carry that around or cart that in your bag. So you want the smaller version. A lot of Drawn and Quarterly books have this sort of issue where they're amazing to hold. I think Blankets is my favorite example of this.
Oh my God.
Beautiful book, big, thick book, but man, to travel with that thing is not easy. Yeah. And I found myself on the rare occasion grabbing the digital version of something that I have on my shelf, but I just don't want to cart it with me on this trip I'm going on or I'm on the plane. So let's grab the digital copy just so I can reread it. But I have it physically too. It's an interesting when that happens. And then I come back and then the question is, which do I read next? Do I go back to that digital copy ever? Or do you kind of like you're more observant of your reading habits when you do these kinds of things. I'm going to kind of jump to a summary for myself. And again, there's no right or wrong here. I want to really clarify that. We're not like, this isn't like, which is better. I think as we're finding, it does come down to the use, to the book itself, the person reading it. I think for me, I still come back to the Mr. Glass art gallery curation sort of. That's kind of my default, which is the stuff that just works incredibly well, that you need a big physical, tangible, visible. I mean, I think A Tale of Sand perfectly illustrates this. I would never want to own Jim Henson's A Tale of Sand digitally. It wouldn't work the same way at all. Like you have to physically have it for a variety of reasons. So that's kind of my go-to. I'm always out on the lookout for books like that where I'm like, man, I'm going to treasure this thing. And I feel like I'm curating an art gallery. Like every time I look at my comic shelf, like, it's getting pretty packed right now, but I always look at it going, what could I stand to lose to make room for something even better? And I'm constantly sort of updating that so I don't sprawl out too much. Meanwhile, I have a pretty full Comixology library of stuff I've purchased over time. And I feel like for the most part, the things that I have purchased work really well in that format. I would not usually get them physically anyway. I think about all the He-Man books, single issues and stuff I've read. I'm perfectly happy having them digitally, especially because they refuse to put them out in any good quality packaging on the physical side. The trades are just bog standard. Like there's nothing interesting about it, and they work better with that backlight and guided view digitally. So I think all my digital stuff has been largely purchased with that in mind. Like which of these formats is going to work better for the book, and how big of a fan of the property am I? And I think that's kind of where I fall.
Well, the one that jumps to mind to me that we've mentioned several times is like Drawn and Quarterly. I don't want any of my Drawn and Quarterly books digitally.
How could you imagine?
But the same thing is like, I'm probably not going to take Jerusalem on a plane. It's like a big, thick book. Yeah. But it's beautiful. What occurs to me as listening to you say that is there's this weird irony to me, which is it's those big two with their heroes that have been going on for like 70 freaking years that are kind of running the show, but also screwing some of the model up, because I don't want to pay $4 an issue for Superman comics, but often the arcs, more often in like DC and Marvel, the arcs aren't that interesting. Like it's not like its own perfectly situated story, So waiting until the trade comes out is also not an option. Mm-hmm. So there's this weird irony of like, I'm much more likely to go into a comic book shop and go, oh, this issue of Batman looks interesting, and picking it up. It's like they're based on the single issue. That's who's running the show. That's the whole order the single issues and then collect them model comes from them. Like Image, you can almost imagine if they had their druthers, it would be like, hey, let's just publish books.
Yeah.
True. I don't know where to come down on any of that. I would say
real quick while you were talking, the one thing we haven't mentioned that I'm sure somebody will point out is a lot of times, even still, the digital copy of a single issue or trade, but let's just say single issues, is not going to have ads. And all those physical versions still pack those ads in. And a lot of the digital versions of those, I've purchased DC books that do not have ads, and I find the same issue in the store, and it does. More and more digitally, that's changing, but that's still largely. I mean, that was a huge appeal to buy things digitally. It's like, I don't have to deal with these ads, even though it's the same price or less in a lot of cases. It's strange they made that choice, but it is worth kind of thinking about.
No, that's a great point. It's not a comic book example, but there is this app that is advertised on so many podcasts that we will now guarantee never having as a sponsor. The Texture app, where you read magazines. And I was not aware. It just didn't occur to me that like, no, it's a great version. It's not just a scanned in magazine, but all the ads are there. And so why am I paying for your app?
Interesting.
I mean, I don't know. At some point you got to think that with magazines anyway, like why am I paying for an issue of whatever major, Condé Nast publication this is? Why am I paying for it if you're also going to put ads in it? Like
that's a good point. That's a really good point.
Yeah. Anyway, I think this is a great discussion. It's obviously something that will come up again and again. I do love that, we've been doing this probably for like a year and a half where we've regularly been asking each other, did you read this in digital or print?
Yeah.
That's something we'll continue to talk about. And I'm sure at some point we'll talk about a book where one of us has read it in print and one's read it digitally, and like how that experience differs. Like I had mentioned before, a good example of that is is Descender, which I read in print, didn't enjoy so much, which is so strange because the art is wonderful, and then really got into the story digitally. But anyway, as this discussion continues, Taylor, where can people find us?
We are wherever podcasts are found: Stitcher, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, and more. Tell your friends to search and subscribe to Panelism on those services. You can also find us online. Our website is panelism.inc. That's INK, as well as our Instagram handle. Search Instagram for panelism.inc and follow us. We've been doing some really fun stuff. Lots of new followers on Instagram. Big shout out to you guys. Glad you're listeners now too. If you have anything you want to suggest in terms of guests, and we're going to have some upcoming guests as well. We used to do that a little bit more often. That's coming back. If you have any suggestions for books, if you're a creator and want us to check out a book, as some people have reached out with, please let us know. We've got a lot of lot of ground to cover in 2019. So we'll be looking for a lot of new things to feature, and I think really expand our catalog of stuff that we talk about. Welcome to Panelism, the podcast where we talk about the. I knew that was.
I don't think you were ready.
No.
Welcome to podcast, the Panelism, where we comics and graphic novels, the shelves.